The name Dracula instantly conjures one perfectly distinct image, an aristocratic vampire, a pallid prince of darkness lurking in a Gothic castle amidst the Transylvanian mists. But here's a paradoxical fact that absolutely shatters this myth to its core. The actual historical figure who bore that chilling moniker was a knight of the sacred Christian Order of the Dragon, an elite brotherhood formed to defend Europe against the perceived threats of the non-Christian world. His primary mission wasn't to hunt the living, but to wage a desperate, bloody war, a fight for the very survival of Christendom against the relentless advance of the mighty Ottoman Empire. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, was no creature of nightmare, but the final bulwark against invaders who had just shattered the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire. This fundamental contradiction, the chasm between a heroic defender and a globally recognized monster, is precisely where our story begins. We've grown accustomed to seeing Dracula through the lens of Bram Stoker's novel, a quintessential figure of the horror genre. But his true history is far more intricate and chilling than any work of fiction. It unfolded not in a realm of the supernatural, but on the brutal stage of 15th century geopolitics, where a small principality caught between two colossal powers, the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, fought tooth and nail simply to exist. And the methods employed for its survival proved so radical that they spawned the most enduring dark legend in all of human history. So, let's be clear about the genre right from the start. This won't be a Gothic horror story, nor a simple retelling of vampire legends. Instead, imagine a historical detective story, a political thriller unearthing tales of power, betrayal, and the very genesis of history's first truly massive information warfare campaign. We'll delve into how, and more importantly, why the name of a real man, one his own people considered a harsh but righteous ruler, was deliberately warped into a byword for absolute, almost satanic, evil. This is an epic drama, not about a man battling malevolent spirits, but about a solitary figure clashing with the ruthless machinery of grand politics. And what astounds me most here isn't the legendary cruelty of Vlad the Impaler itself, which undoubtedly was very real. No, what truly astounds is the astonishing effectiveness of the propaganda that utterly demonized him. Just imagine this: a mere few dozen pages of printed text, incendiary pamphlets published by his enemies in Germany, proved more potent than hundreds of actual battles combined. This informational strike was so precise and devastating that 5.5 centuries later, we still inhabit the world it forged. The myth has utterly consumed and supplanted reality, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying aspect of this entire saga. We will confront questions that typically remain unasked, lurking just beyond the conventional narrative. Were scorched earth tactics and mass executions merely the sadistic whims of a madman, or were they the only language he could speak, the only one his formidable enemies would truly comprehend? Was the chilling forest of the Impaled, a sight that reportedly struck terror even into the heart of the conquering Ottoman Sultan, an act of meaningless barbarity, or a stroke of psychological genius that spared his nation from imminent annihilation? Where lies the definitive line where a protector of his homeland transforms into a monster, and who ultimately holds the authority to draw that crucial boundary? His contemporaries, future generations, or perhaps the very enemies he fought? I invite you to step beyond being a mere spectator and instead become a juror in this historical trial unfolding across centuries. Together, we will meticulously examine the evidence: ancient chronicles, revealing letters, archaeological findings, and, naturally, those very propaganda broadsheets that birthed the myth. Our objective isn't to justify or condemn, but to truly grasp the complex logic underpinning these monumental and tragic events. We will endeavor to peel back the layers, separating the historical Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, from the sinister doppelganger spawned by centuries of fear, hatred, and calculated political maneuvering. To truly comprehend Dracula's motives, we must first cast aside all notions of Gothic castles and velvet jerkins. Let's transport ourselves instead to his actual world, Wallachia in the mid-15th century. And we'll do so not through dry maps and dates, but through raw sensory experience. Imagine, if you will, the thick, heavy air of a military encampment along the banks of the Danube River. Here, the stench of sweat from thousands of unwashed bodies, both human and equine, mingled with the sour tang of cheap wine sloshing from goatskin pouches, the acrid smoke of hundreds of campfires boiling bland barley gruel, and the subtle yet omnipresent metallic scent of fresh blood and honed steel. This isn't the ambience of an aristocratic court. It's the suffocating atmosphere of relentless, grueling war for sheer survival. And the sounds here match the mood perfectly. This wasn't the echoing silence of a vampire's crypt. This was the continuous hum of life teetering on the edge of death. The creak of leather harnesses, the soft nicker of war horses, guttural conversations in dozens of dialects, Wallachian, Hungarian, Serbian, Turkish, Serbian. Somewhere in the distance, a field smith's hammer clanged rhythmically, straightening a bent helmet. At night, the howl of wolves drifted from the dense forest, frightening no more than the sudden quiet. Because silence in this land meant one thing: the enemy was near, lurking and waiting. This was a world where senses were sharpened to an absolute edge, where every rustle could be the last sound you ever heard. To survive in such a world, one needed a unique psychological makeup and reliance on fundamental concepts that might seem alien to us today. The first and foremost was the idea of antemurale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christianity. Remember that phrase? It's the key to everything. Just a few years earlier, in 1453, Constantinople, the thousand-year-old capital of Orthodox Christianity, had fallen. For the people of that era, it was an apocalypse, the end of the world as they knew it. And now, small principalities like Wallachia found themselves on the absolute front line, the first barrier of defense. Their rulers, including Vlad, didn't just see themselves as feudal lords. They perceived themselves as warriors of Christ, the final wall safeguarding Europe from the Ottoman deluge. This wasn't politics, it was a sacred mission. The second cultural code wasn't directed outward, but inward within the country itself. This was the Wallachian word, dreptate. It can be translated as justice or righteousness, but its true meaning is far deeper and harsher. For the common peasant, weary of the arbitrary abuses of corrupt boyars and incessant raids, dreptate was first and foremost about order. Iron-fisted, unyielding, even brutal order. When a thief knew his hand would be severed and a traitor knew the stake awaited him, that was dreptate. Vlad's cruelty, directed against the boyar elite and criminals, was perceived by the people not as tyranny, but as the establishment of that very supreme, if bloody, justice. To truly grasp Vlad's predicament, let's find a precise, compelling analogy from our modern world. Imagine Wallachia isn't a state, but a small, yet strategically crucial tech company. On one side, it's under immense pressure from a giant corporation, Ottoman Inc., which wants to completely absorb it. On the other, there's a supposed partner, Hungary Group, which actually wants to exploit its resources, then bankrupt it and seize its assets. Meanwhile, the board of directors, composed of corrupt boyars, is steeped in corruption and constantly leaking insider information to competitors. In this scenario, Vlad Dracula isn't just a tough manager. He's a CEO who, to prevent a hostile takeover, is willing to burn down his own data servers rather than let them fall into enemy hands. He's the CEO who doesn't just fire top-level executives caught spying, but publicly executes them right in the open plan office, ensuring no one else ever even considers betrayal. His strategy is to make his company so toxic, so unpredictable, and so dangerous to acquire that both superpowers prefer to keep their distance. This isn't doing business by the rules. This is a war of annihilation fought with every means available. The turning point. The very catalyst that unleashed a chain of irreversible changes wasn't a single event, but the sum of his entire youth. To understand Dracula, you must remember that he ascended to the throne not as an heir apparent in peacetime. He returned to a country that had betrayed him. After spending his youth as a political hostage at the Ottoman court, Vlad learned that his father, Wallachian ruler Vlad II Dracula, had been overthrown and murdered. And he wasn't killed by the Turks. He was murdered by his own people, the Wallachian Boyars, the aristocratic elite, with the backing of the Hungarian regent. They didn't stop there. Vlad's elder brother Mircea was blinded with red-hot iron rods and then buried alive. Imagine the psychological state of this young man. He returns to his homeland, but this homeland is a scorched wasteland, steeped in his family's blood. The very people who should have been the throne's pillars proved to be its executioners. His supposed ally, the Hungarian king, was an accomplice to the murders. And his former enemies, the Ottomans, were the only force that helped him briefly reclaim the throne. This experience seared one simple, terrifying truth into his consciousness. No one could be trusted. Not the Boyars, not the Hungarians, not the Turks. Wallachia was weak not because of external foes, but because of internal rot. The country was ruled not by a prince, but by a tangle of perpetually scheming Boyar clans, ready to sell out their homeland to anyone for an extra sack of gold. It was precisely at this harrowing moment that his grand, terrifying vision was born. If the sickness resided within, it couldn't be treated with poultices. It demanded surgical intervention, with fire and sword. Vlad realized that the old rules of the game, feudal agreements, concessions to the nobility, attempts to balance clan interests, simply no longer worked. They were leading the country to ruin. The only way to save Wallachia was to forge an entirely new system of power, a system built not on compromise, but on fear. A system where there was only one center of gravity, himself, the voivode. Everyone else either had to submit unconditionally or disappear. This blueprint was, for the 15th century, something utterly unheard of, almost revolutionary. Vlad Dracula decided to become not just another feudal ruler, but an absolute monarch, an autocrat whose will was the sole law. He was the driving force behind this idea, its living embodiment. The years spent at the Sultan's court, where he witnessed how centralized, despotic power operated, had not been in vain. He resolved to transpose this model onto Wallachian soil, fusing Ottoman ruthlessness with the Byzantine concept of a monarch's divine right, and seasoning it all with his personal, hard-won thirst for vengeance and for justice. He intended to build a strong, independent state on the bones of those who had sought to destroy it. And he wasted no time putting his plan into motion. His very first action upon ascending the throne served as a declaration of this new order. Legend has it that on Easter of 1457, he summoned hundreds of boyars and their families to his capital, Targoviste, the very ones who had participated in the conspiracies against his father and brother. They arrived for the feast in their finest attire, brimming with self-assurance, convinced the young prince was just another puppet. In the midst of the banquet, Vlad posed a single question. How many princes have occupied the Wallachian throne in your lifetime? The Boyars, boasting of their longevity and political sway, eagerly vied to call out numbers, 7, 10, 12. Each of their answers was, for Vlad, an admission of their treachery, proof that they were the very cause of the country's perpetual instability. What followed had the explosive impact of a bomb. At Vlad's signal, the guards seized all the guests. Right there, in the town square, the elderly and infirm boyars, the cream of the aristocracy, were impaled. There were several hundred of them. Those who were younger and healthier, along with their wives and daughters, still in their festive garments, were marched under escort to a construction site. They were forced to build, with their bare hands, the walls of Vlad's new fortress, the very one that would later become known as Poenari Castle. Many perished from exhaustion directly on the construction site, their bodies simply entombed within the walls. This was not merely an act of revenge. It was a political manifesto, monstrous in its stark visibility. In a single day, Vlad Dracula decapitated the entire old aristocracy, obliterating the very foundation of boyar opposition. No one in Wallachia, or even in neighboring countries, had expected such icy, calculated, and absolute brutality from him. He didn't just punish those guilty of his family's deaths. He showed everyone that the era of the oligarchy was over. A new age had dawned in Wallachia, the age of Dracula. How could tiny Wallachia, whose army rarely numbered more than 10,000 or 12,000 men, possibly stand against the Ottoman Empire, capable of fielding an army of 100,000 battle-hardened warriors? The answer lies in Vlad Dracula's ingenious military doctrine. And if we're searching for a central metaphor, the image of a hornet's nest fits perfectly. A giant bear might tear it apart, but the cost would be far too steep. Every attempt to approach would be met with hundreds of furious, painful stings from all directions. Dracula transformed his entire country into such a hornet's nest, where every forest, every swamp, and every village became a weapon. Let's take a look under the hood of this total war machine. Vlad understood perfectly that his army was doomed in an open field battle. So he abandoned classic chivalric tactics, instead betting on asymmetric warfare, a guerrilla struggle we might today call hybrid warfare. He was the first in Europe to grasp that the immense Ottoman army's greatest strengths, its sheer numbers and its logistics, were simultaneously its most significant vulnerabilities. A massive army needs to be fed, watered, and supplied with fodder. Deprive it of these, and it would begin to devour itself. And here's how this played out in practice. Let's paint a vivid step-by-step picture of the invasion through the eyes of the Turks. Step 1. The Ottoman army crosses the Danube River and enters the lands of Wallachia. But instead of prosperous villages and overflowing barns, they find a scorched earth wasteland. By Dracula's command, peasants had already driven livestock into the mountains, burned crops, and most crucially, poisoned the wells. From the very first day of their march, the invading forces begin to suffer from hunger and thirst. This wasn't mere vandalism, it was a meticulously planned scorched earth strategy, executed to absolute perfection. Step 2. Exhausted from a day's march, the army stops for the night. But there is no rest. As soon as dusk falls, all hell breaks loose. Small mobile units of Wallachian light cavalry, known as kurteni, burst forth from their forest hideaways. Their goal isn't to engage in pitched battle, but to sow chaos and panic. They attack flanks, slaughter sentries, set fire to supply wagons, and then vanish back into the night. These lightning-fast raids repeat again and again, every single night, denying the enemy a moment's peace. Dracula personally led such attacks, and on one occasion, disguised as a Turkish merchant, he even infiltrated the enemy camp himself to assess its layout before a nighttime assault. Step 3. Psychological warfare. Dracula understood that fear was as potent a weapon as any sword or spear. Prisoners captured during the nighttime forays weren't immediately killed. Instead, a gruesome, agonizing execution awaited them. Impalement. Stakes of varying heights were erected along the roads the Ottoman army traveled, creating ghastly avenues of dying men. This wasn't done out of sadism, but with a cold, calculated, almost engineering-like purpose to break the enemy's fighting spirit. Every Turkish soldier, witnessing this spectacle, knew exactly what awaited them if captured. This primal terror eroded discipline and the will to fight better than any conventional weapon could. Step 4. The climax. The night attack at Targovishte. When the colossal army of Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, finally reached the Wallachian capital, Dracula unleashed his most audacious move. Leading an elite detachment of 7,000 horsemen, many disguised in Turkish attire, he personally stormed the heart of the Ottoman camp. His target, the Sultan's own tent, to sow confusion, kill the commander, and decapitate the army. He very nearly succeeded. Panic erupted throughout the camp. In the darkness, the Turks hacked at one another, mistaking their comrades for foes. Though the Sultan escaped assassination, the attack inflicted immense damage and utterly demoralized the Ottoman forces. It was after this night, upon approaching the walls of Targovishte, that Mehmed II and his army beheld the final terrifying crescendo of this symphony of horror. The infamous Forest of the Impaled, a field 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, bristling with 20,000 stakes, each bearing the decaying bodies of captured Turks and Bulgarians. The sight was so apocalyptic that even the Sultan, who had witnessed rivers of blood during the siege of Constantinople, was utterly shaken. He uttered the famous words, "It is impossible to take the country from a man who can do such things." And he retreated. Tiny, impoverished Wallachia, wielding terror as a weapon, had defeated the greatest army in the world. This was the mechanics of Dracula's miracle. We talk a lot about Vlad's strategy and tactics, but what was his rule like from the inside, through the eyes of an ordinary person? Let's try to imagine it. For a common Wallachian merchant in the 15th century, traveling from one town to another was a deadly undertaking. On any road, he could be robbed by a brigand, or even worse, by the armed retinue of some local boyar, for whom the law meant nothing. Now, imagine this. Under Dracula, that same merchant could, for the first time in his life, travel across the entire country with a purse at his belt and not fear being killed for a few coins. And all this happened not because people suddenly became honest, but because everyone, from the petty thief to the noble lord, knew that the punishment for a crime would not just be severe, it would be absolute and inescapable. But who were the hands and eyes of this system of total control? Vlad's genius could not have been realized without thousands of unsung executors. This brings us to his primary personnel decision. He completely replaced the elite. After annihilating the old boyar aristocracy, he created a new one from scratch. His understated heroes were not brilliant generals, but hundreds of low-born individuals utterly loyal to him. These were simple soldiers who had distinguished themselves in battle, minor landowners, and even foreign mercenaries. He granted them lands confiscated from executed boyars and gave them positions that had previously been hereditary. These new nobles, known as viteji, or braves, were his main pillar of support. Unlike the old clans, they had no independent power, wealth, or connections. Everything they possessed, they owed personally to Dracula. Their loyalty was guaranteed not by honor, but by the instinct for self-preservation. They knew that the hand that elevated them could just as easily destroy them. These were the very people who became his administrators, tax collectors, and local judges. They were the nervous system of his state, carrying the prince's will to the most remote corners of Wallachia, and just as importantly, relaying information about the slightest sign of discontent back to the prince. The second key group was his personal troops, those flying detachments of light cavalry. These were not merely soldiers, they were his special forces, his Praetorian Guard. They were the ones who carried out the most daring and brutal operations: night attacks, sabotage behind enemy lines, and punitive raids against disloyal villages. They were groomed in the same paradigm of fear and personal allegiance. Vlad paid them handsomely, but also demanded unquestioning obedience. Their effectiveness was the linchpin of his military machine. Without these swift, ruthless, and unseen riders, his hornet's nest tactics would never have worked. And now, that astonishing everyday detail that best illustrates the atmosphere of the era. Chroniclers, even those hostile to Vlad, preserved the same story. In the center of his capital, Targovishte, in the main square by the well, stood a large basin made of pure gold. It was there for any traveler, rich or poor, to quench their thirst. This basin, a true treasure, lay in plain sight, day and night, without any guard whatsoever. And in all the years of Dracula's reign, no one ever stole it. No one even dared to touch it with ill intent. Because every inhabitant of Wallachia, from the beggar to the boyar, knew with absolute certainty what awaited a thief if caught. They would not just be executed, they would be impaled right there in that same square next to the golden basin, so that their agony would serve as a vivid lesson for everyone else. This golden basin isn't just a historical anecdote, it's the perfect symbol of Dracula's rule. He gave people order and security previously unheard of, but the price of that order was an all-pervading, paralyzing fear. The people behind his success were not just his loyal warriors and officials. They were also that hypothetical thief who, looking at the gold, chose to stay alive. Vlad didn't just govern people, he governed their most basic instinct. It's the summer of 1462. Vlad Dracula is at the zenith of his fame. He has accomplished the impossible. His tiny principality has withstood the full might of the Ottoman Empire. The demoralized army of Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, suffering colossal losses, was retreating back across the Danube. All of Christian Europe, from Venice to the Vatican, applauded the Wallachian voivode. His name was on everyone's lips. He was more than just a ruler. He was a living legend, a new Alexander the Great who had halted the invincible Turks. It seemed the system, built on fear and total mobilization, had worked perfectly. Now, all that remained was to launch a counterattack, to cement the victory. It was precisely at this moment of triumph that the perfect storm began to gather. Vlad understood that merely repelling an invasion was only half the battle. The Ottomans would return. He needed to carry the war into their territory, support anti-Turkish uprisings in Bulgaria, and finally secure the southern border. But his own army was exhausted, and his country ravaged by the scorched earth tactics. He desperately needed fresh forces. So, he turned for help to the only person obligated to assist him, his formal suzerain and ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Corvinus was at that very moment moving south with a large army, funded by money the Pope himself had earmarked specifically for a crusade against the Turks. The plan seemed flawless. But Dracula, a genius of distrust, a master at reading the minds of his enemies, made one fatal error. He viewed the situation from his own perspective, that of a defender of Christianity. He should have viewed it through the eyes of Matthias Corvinus. The Hungarian king saw something entirely different. He saw his vassal, whom he considered his pawn, transform into an independent, incredibly popular and dangerous figure on the European stage. Dracula's fame overshadowed Corvinus's own. A strong, independent Wallachia under such a charismatic and ruthless leader posed a greater threat to Hungary than the distant Turks. Corvinus didn't need a powerful ally, he needed a docile buffer on his border. And that's when Vlad's system faltered. He, who had never trusted anyone, was forced to bet on allied loyalty. In the autumn of 1462, full of hope, Dracula set off to meet Corvinus's army, intending to combine forces for a decisive strike against the Ottomans. But instead of fraternal embraces and a joint war council, a trap awaited him. By order of the Hungarian king, Vlad was seized and clapped in irons. The hero of the Christian world, the vanquisher of the Sultan, was arrested by his own ally on an absurd charge: secret correspondence with the Turks and betrayal of the Christian cause. And here we see how the greatest strength of Dracula's system became his primary vulnerability. His absolute ruthlessness and effectiveness, his reputation as a man who would stop at nothing to win, ultimately worked against him. He was so unpredictable and terrifying that his betrayal was all too easy to believe. His harshness, which had saved his country from an external enemy, left him utterly isolated and defenseless in the face of internal treachery. He had no allies capable of interceding for him because his system did not countenance alliances, only subjugation. He was a lone wolf, and when he was cornered, no one came to his defense. To justify his perfidy to the Pope, who was demanding an accounting for the crusade funds, Matthias Corvinus and his inner circle orchestrated a stroke of genius. They didn't merely arrest Vlad, they launched the first large-scale smear campaign in history, leveraging the cutting-edge technology of the printing press. Fabricated letters, ostensibly proving Dracula's collusion with the Sultan, began to circulate. But more importantly, anonymous pamphlets began to spread like wildfire across Germany, blending genuine accounts of his cruelty with the most monstrous fabrications. Tales of feasting amidst corpses, of roasting infants, and of reveling in his victim's agony. The image of a heroic defender was systematically tarnished and replaced with that of an infernal, sadistic madman. And so, at the zenith of his glory, the vanquisher of Mehmed the Conqueror found himself in a dungeon, accused of the very crime he was least likely to commit. His country once again plunged into the chaos of Boyar infighting. His army was disbanded. What could be worse than being killed by an enemy? Only one thing: to be betrayed and slandered by an ally who steals not your life, but your very name. But could Vlad have ever imagined that this very slander, this insidious informational poison, would prove more enduring than all his victories, outliving him by many centuries? Matthias Corvinus's betrayal seems utterly irrational. Why would one weaken a pivotal ally at the very moment the Ottoman threat loomed large? Yet this action was underpinned by a cold, cynical logic, one rooted not merely in politics but in economics. Let's delve into the financial underpinnings of these events. On the eve of these events, Pope Pius II, inspired by Dracula's victories, granted the Hungarian king an enormous sum, 40,000 gold florins. This was a targeted grant specifically for organizing a major crusade. Let's translate this abstract sum into something tangible for our understanding. 40,000 florins equated to approximately 150 kilograms of pure gold. With this money, one could maintain an army of 10,000 mercenaries for an entire year. This sum would have been sufficient to build an entire fleet from scratch, one capable of challenging the Venetians for supremacy on the Adriatic Sea. It was a colossal capital, comparable to the annual budget of a mid-sized European kingdom. And all this money ended up in the hands of Matthias Corvinus. Helping Vlad meant expending these funds on a perilous war. Arresting him and declaring him a traitor, however, meant keeping all these funds for his own purposes, to consolidate his power within Hungary, settle accounts with his mercenaries, and construct lavish palaces. The choice between sacred duty and personal gain was starkly clear. Historians, of course, are far from a consensus on this matter. There is also an alternative theory, one decidedly more lenient toward Corvinus. Some researchers suggest the Hungarian king genuinely feared Dracula. He saw Vlad as an unpredictable radical, an uncontrollable asset whose cruelty and ambitions could at any moment turn against Hungary itself. After all, Vlad wasn't merely waging war against the Turks. He was striving to forge a strong, centralized Wallachia, completely independent of the Hungarian crown. Perhaps Corvinus reasoned as a pragmatist, better to have a weak, puppet Wallachia on the border under the sway of pro-Hungarian Boyars than a strong and unpredictable one, even if it was hostile to the Turks. Within this logic, Dracula's arrest wasn't an act of betrayal, but a preemptive strike against a potential rival. But let's return to Vlad himself and examine his actions through the prism of their hidden meanings. His entire life was a succession of not just military, but also profoundly symbolic acts. He perfectly understood the language of symbols and actively leveraged it. Take, for instance, his very sobriquet, Dracula. He inherited it from his father, Vlad II, who had been initiated into the knightly order of the Dragon. This dragon, depicted vanquishing the crescent moon, was a potent symbol of the struggle against the Ottomans. Vlad III didn't merely adopt this name, he forged it into his personal brand, his very manifesto. Whether minting coins or signing documents, he underscored his allegiance to this sacred alliance. It was a clear signal to all of Europe. I am no mere Wallachian prince. I am a soldier of Christ on the front lines. Or consider another, far grimmer example, impalement. This execution method wasn't chosen at random. To a European, it was simply an excruciating death. But within the cultural code of the Ottomans, it carried a unique, profoundly humiliating significance. It was a shameful punishment reserved for bandits and cowards. By applying it en masse to captured Turkish warriors, Vlad wasn't merely killing them. He was inflicting the deepest symbolic insult upon the entire Ottoman war machine, upon the Sultan himself. He was speaking their language. To me, you are not noble warriors, but contemptible brigands. This was information warfare, waged not with words, but with the bodies of his enemies. Even his domestic policies were steeped in symbolism. The execution of Boyars on Easter wasn't merely a convenient date choice. It was an act of monstrous sacrilege intended to declare, for the establishment of a new order, nothing is sacred. The old world will be razed to its foundations. And the construction of Poenari Citadel by the aristocracy's own hands wasn't just a utilitarian task. It was an act of ritual humiliation. Those accustomed to living in luxury at the country's expense were now, in their silk garments, building the stronghold of a new, centralized power with their bare hands. Every stone in that fortress wall was a symbol of the old elite's downfall. Dracula wasn't just a general and a politician. He was the director of a grand and bloody historical spectacle where every gesture held a hidden meaning. And now, having seen all the components of this drama, from the youthful trauma that laid the foundation of his character, to the cold rationality of his military tactics, to the economic underpinnings of his betrayal, and the informational war that transformed his name into a curse, the picture becomes clear and coherent. We can finally weave all the threads together and attempt to answer the central question: what then is the phenomenon of Vlad Dracula? Why is it that he, one of hundreds of cruel medieval rulers, left such a deep and dark imprint on history? The key, in my view, lies in the fact that he was a man utterly out of sync with his era. He thought and acted in categories that would only become understood and widely accepted centuries later. The 15th century was still an age of feudalism, knightly honor, vassal oaths, and complex aristocratic relationships. But Dracula viewed the world entirely differently. He saw not a tangle of personal connections, but the state as a mechanism, a single organism that must operate efficiently for one purpose: survival. He was no medieval prince. He was, in essence, the first modern statesman, born 300 years ahead of his time. All his actions, however monstrous they may seem, were subservient to one singular idea, the idea of raison d'etat, of state interests. When he annihilated the Boyars, he wasn't simply avenging his family. He was eliminating a class that impeded the centralization of power. When he impaled thieves and Turkish captives, he wasn't reveling in their suffering. He was employing terror as an instrument of state policy to establish internal order and intimidate external enemies. He was a pragmatist to his core, for whom morality, religion, and human life were merely resources in the struggle for sovereignty. In this lies both his genius and his tragedy. He grasped what only Machiavelli, Richelieu, and Peter the Great would fully realize: that to create a strong, centralized state, one must break the resistance of the old aristocracy, forge a new elite loyal solely to the ruler, and subordinate absolutely all spheres of life, from economics to religion, to the interests of the state. He attempted to build an absolute monarchy in a small, backward Wallachia at a time when, in neighboring France or England, such a concept was only just beginning to be dreamed of. He was simply centuries ahead of his time. He cannot be measured by the standards of a mere conqueror or a tyrannical despot. He did not seek to seize foreign lands like Alexander the Great, nor did he revel in power for power's sake. His vision was simultaneously more modest and more radical. He wanted to transform his country from a geopolitical object, from a pawn in the hands of the Hungarians and Turks, into a fully fledged, independent entity. He wanted Wallachia to be reckoned with, to be feared and respected. And to achieve this goal, He was prepared to pay any price, with both others' lives and his own. And when we grasp this, the magnitude of his figure becomes entirely different. This is no longer just a story about a cruel ruler. It is a chronicle of the birth of the modern state from the blood and chaos of the Middle Ages. It is the drama of a man who attempted to leapfrog an entire historical epoch, employing methods that his contemporaries could only attribute to one thing: the intervention of the devil. They didn't perceive political calculation in his actions. They saw only pathological cruelty, because the language he spoke, the language of state terror and political expediency, was still incomprehensible to them. Therefore, the myth of the vampire is not merely a successful move by enemy propaganda. It is also an attempt by his contemporaries to explain something that simply did not fit into their worldview. Vlad's deeds were so far beyond customary notions of war and politics that they demanded a supernatural, infernal explanation. He was so alien to his century that it was easier to declare him a spawn of hell than to recognize in him the harbinger of a new, even more ruthless world, a world where the state stands above the individual. This was a vision of titanic, almost frightening scale. He tried, alone, by the sheer force of his will, to drag his country through a historical portal from the Middle Ages into the early modern era. It's no surprise that he ultimately failed. But this very attempt, audacious and bloody, is what rendered him immortal, first in the pamphlets of his enemies and then in global culture. It would seem that the story of Vlad the Impaler is one of total failure. His vision of a strong, independent Wallachia crumbled. He died in battle, and his country became a vassal of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. But this is only at first glance. The domino effect, set in motion by his actions, and even more importantly, by his myth, proved astonishingly long-lasting and has reverberated to our present day in the most unexpected ways. The first domino to fall wasn't on a battlefield, but in the printing houses of Nuremberg and Augsburg. It was precisely the smear campaign against Dracula, launched by Matthias Corvinus, that became the first historical instance of the printing press being wielded as a weapon of mass informational destruction. These inexpensive brochures, complete with gruesome engravings and tales of the bloodthirsty monster Dracula, became the best sellers of their time. They demonstrated to European monarchs a new, incredible power, the ability to shape public opinion, create images of enemies, and justify any political action. Decades later, Martin Luther would use this very same tool, printed pamphlets, to challenge the Pope, igniting the Reformation. The methodology, honed through the demonization of one Wallachian prince, ultimately reshaped the religious and political map of all of Europe. Dracula's legacy also lives on in things we use today, often without even realizing it. Take, for instance, the very name Dracula. Thanks to Bram Stoker's novel, it has become firmly entrenched in every language worldwide as a synonym for vampire. When we watch a horror movie or dress up for Halloween, we are, in essence, echoing that very propaganda campaign from the 15th century. The black cape with a high collar, the aristocratic demeanor, the sinister castle, these are all elements of the Gothic image crafted by Stoker, but it is fueled by the energy of a myth born 500 years ago. We consume the product of medieval information warfare without ever giving it a second thought. Another, more subtle instance is the very archetype of the stern but just ruler. Vlad's image as a leader who purged his country of corruption and crime with an iron fist has proven remarkably resilient, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia. For 19th century Romanian nationalists, he became a powerful symbol of the fight for independence. During the Ceausescu regime, his figure was practically deified, portrayed as a great patriot and the architect of a strong nation. The dangerous notion that order demands the sacrifice of freedom and human rights, that the ends justify any means, constantly finds its adherents, and strangely enough, the phantom of Dracula often hovers behind such leaders. And this brings us to the central paradox of his legacy. Vlad's original vision was to defend Christendom, to preserve European identity against external threats. He was a bulwark of Christianity. But over time, his image was utterly distorted and transformed into its exact opposite. In popular culture, Dracula is the embodiment of absolute evil, an antichrist, a spawn of darkness, threatening the very world he once swore to protect. The symbolic cross he wore as a knight of the Order of the Dragon, with which he blessed himself before battle, became a weapon against him in vampire mythology. The very object of his faith was twisted into his greatest vulnerability. What a profound and bitter irony of fate. The defender of the cross became the very being repelled by it. History didn't merely forget his true motives, it committed an act of cultural inversion, turning his legacy inside out. The man who dedicated his life to fighting infidels became the ultimate infidel himself, an eternally cursed entity in the annals of Western civilization. Vlad Dracula's story, viewed through the prism of centuries, might seem like an exotic tale from a distant, dark past. A cruel prince, impaling stakes, sultans. What does any of this have in common with our world? A world of social media, artificial intelligence, and a global economy. In reality, far more than one might think. Let's try to draw a clear parallel to modern times. The fundamental problems Vlad faced haven't vanished. They've simply changed their costumes. A small nation caught between two warring superpowers struggling to preserve its sovereignty. Isn't that an apt description of dozens of states in the contemporary world, navigating the spheres of influence of the United States, China, or Russia? A political elite willing to sell out national interests for personal gain. Have corruption and betrayal ceased to be driving forces in politics? And finally, the weaponization of information to destroy an opponent's reputation, creating fake news to justify one's own actions. Isn't our era the golden age for precisely such tactics? Only now, instead of the printing press, we have troll farms and viral videos. The core problems remain the same: survival, power, betrayal, propaganda. Only the tools have evolved. Dracula's story isn't merely a medieval case study. It's a timeless model of behavior during an existential crisis. It illustrates the extremes to which a state and its leader might go when their very existence is at stake. And by examining this, we can better grasp the logic behind many contemporary conflicts that strike us as irrational and savage. So, what's the most crucial, non-obvious lesson we can draw from this narrative? It's not that cruelty is inherently bad or that power inevitably corrupts. That's common knowledge. The lesson is far more subtle and pertinent. Dracula's story teaches us that reality and reputation are two entirely distinct, often unconnected entities. And ultimately, in the long arc of history, victory doesn't go to the strongest on the battlefield, but to the one who controls the narrative, who writes the history. Vlad Dracula won his most significant battles. He halted the Ottoman invasion. He forged a powerful state. But he lost the information war, and that defeat proved fatal to his legacy. His adversaries crafted such a potent and compelling myth that it completely erased his true accomplishments from the memory of posterity. His story stands as ultimate proof that a word, an image, a pamphlet can be a far more destructive weapon than an army. And this insight is critically important today, in the 21st century, as we drown in an ocean of information. Every single day, we face attempts to manipulate our opinions, to forge black legends about certain people, nations, or events. We are force-fed, ready-made images of heroes and villains. Dracula's story serves as a potent immunization against naivety. It compels us to ask, who is telling this story? Why are they telling it? Whose interest does a particular image serve? It teaches us to separate fact from propaganda and to remember that behind even the most monstrous myth may lie the tragedy of a real human being. Here's the preliminary conclusion I'd like to draw. Vlad Dracula was neither a saint nor a demon. He was a physician, a brutal, ruthless surgeon who tried to save a terminally ill patient, his country, with amputation and cauterization by red-hot iron. We can be horrified by his methods, but we cannot deny that he fought for that patient's life. His tragedy is that, after the operation, he was accused of murder, and the medical history was written by those who were the very cause of the illness. And that medical history turned out to be so well written that we're still reading it today. To truly grasp the scale of Dracula's drama, we must make an intellectual effort and view the world through the eyes of his principal enemy. And here, we need to immediately abandon the cartoonish image of a wild Ottoman horde. Vlad's adversary wasn't a faceless mob of turbaned barbarians. It was one of the most advanced, sophisticated, and powerful civilizations of its time. At its helm wasn't merely a cruel conqueror, but a Renaissance man, Sultan Mehmed II, Fatih, the Conqueror. This individual spoke 6 languages, including Latin and Greek, devoured the works of ancient historians, and patronized Italian artists and engineers. Upon taking Constantinople, he saw himself not as a destroyer, but as the successor to the Roman Empire, a new Constantine or Caesar, uniting East and West under his dominion. His empire wasn't a chaotic collection of tribes, but a perfectly calibrated military and bureaucratic machine. Its elite, the Janissaries, constituted Europe's first regular professional army, raised in Spartan conditions and fiercely loyal to the Sultan himself. The Ottoman state was built on principles of order, hierarchy, and relentless expansion, which they considered their historical and religious mission. For them, Wallachia was not an independent kingdom, but a rebellious province, a buffer zone that, by all rights, should have paid tribute and submitted to the will of Istanbul, as many others did. In their eyes, this was the natural order of things, the logic of empire building. Now, let's look in the mirror. How did Vlad Dracula himself appear in the eyes of Mehmed and his inner circle? They didn't see a defender of Christianity. They saw a treacherous vassal. We must remember that Vlad and his younger brother, Radu the Handsome, spent their youth as honored hostages at the Ottoman court. They grew up alongside Mehmed, received the same education, and learned the same martial arts. The Sultan considered Vlad almost his protege. And when Vlad, having gained his throne with Ottoman assistance, turned his weapons against his former patrons, for Mehmed, it wasn't just an act of war. It was an act of profound, personal betrayal. This is precisely why Vlad's methods caused not merely fear, but cultural shock among the Turks. The Ottoman army waged war according to its own, albeit harsh, yet understandable rules. There were rituals for declaring war, rules for besieging cities, and a code for treating captured aristocrats. War was a craft, almost an art. But what Dracula did simply didn't fit into their worldview. He didn't fight pitched battles. He attacked at night. He didn't take prisoners. He tortured them to death. He poisoned wells and burned villages, condemning not only the army, but also his own population to starvation. From their perspective, these weren't the actions of a sovereign, but the behavior of a wild, rabid beast who violated all divine and human laws. The infamous Forest of the Impaled was for them not so much an act of deterrence as it was the apotheosis of this barbaric madness. It was something utterly beyond their understanding of warfare. It's one thing to cut down an enemy in battle, it's another to orchestrate this theater of total senseless cruelty. Even the stunned Mehmed's declaration, "It is impossible to take a country from a man capable of such deeds," wasn't so much an acknowledgement of military genius as it was a statement of fact. He had encountered something irrational, something that defied the laws of logic and honor. He came to fight a prince, but met a demon. And therein lies the tragedy of the Ottomans' predictability. Their greatest strength, order, discipline, systematic execution, became their greatest weakness when clashing with Dracula. Their military machine was designed to combat another machine like itself. It was ready for open field battles, for proper sieges, for champions' duels. But it was utterly unprepared for total war on scorched earth, for guerrilla raids, for psychological terror. They were like a grandmaster who arrived for a chess match, only to find his opponent, instead of making moves, started throwing pieces at him, burning the board and biting his legs. All their strategy, all their centuries-old military wisdom proved useless in the face of absolute chaos. They were strong, but predictable. Vlad was weak, but utterly unpredictable. And in this asymmetry, he found his single, yet deadly advantage. Behind every grand design, there is always an enormous price, and the genius of Vlad Dracula was no exception. His methods were effective, but they demanded that he cross every conceivable moral boundary. Let's consider one specific, complex, and illustrative decision. On one occasion, envoys from the Ottoman Sultan arrived at Vlad's court. Entering the throne room, they greeted the prince, but, according to their custom, did not remove their turbans. Vlad, interpreting this as a sign of disrespect for his authority, asked why they had not done so. The envoys replied that it was the law of their country and the faith of their fathers. Vlad's response entered the annals of his black legend. He declared that he wished to strengthen them in their law and ordered his guards to nail their turbans to the envoys' heads. This act seems like the height of insane sadism. But was it only that? For Vlad, it wasn't an act of blind rage, but a political performance. He was sending the Sultan an unmistakable signal. On my land, my rules apply. Your imperial arrogance holds no sway here. I am not your vassal. I am a sovereign ruler. It was an assertion of independence, delivered in the most brutal and enemy-understandable language. But the consequence of this monstrous act was a final and irrevocable break with the Ottoman Empire. The bridges were burned. A major war became inevitable. To assert his sovereignty, Vlad consciously sacrificed not only the lives of the envoys, but also the very possibility of peace, pushing his country to the brink of annihilation. It was precisely such decisions, made in complete solitude, that changed him from within. Let's try to peer into his inner world. Initially, perhaps he was driven by a thirst for justice, albeit in its darkest Old Testament understanding, an eye for an eye. He punished specific individuals for specific crimes, Boyars for the murder of his father and brother, thieves for robberies. But the burden of absolute power, the constant expectation of betrayal from all sides, transformed him into a paranoiac. He was alone at the apex of a pyramid of fear that he himself had constructed. And to prevent this pyramid from crumbling, he had to constantly raise the stakes, making the terror ever more pervasive. Gradually, his struggle against the enemies of the state morphed into a war against every perceived imperfection of human nature. According to German pamphlets, he began to cleanse the land of beggars, vagrants, and the infirm, reportedly burning them alive in specially constructed houses under the guise of freeing them from earthly suffering. Whether this is historical truth or propaganda's dark invention, we cannot say for certain. Yet, this image perfectly encapsulates the probable transformation of his psyche. From a pragmatist wielding terror as a tool, he evolved into a messianic figure, a self-appointed social surgeon who believed he had the right to excise the unhealthy parts of society. The system he created, ostensibly to protect the state, began to devour society itself, and its architect transformed from a protector into an executioner. But the most horrifying sacrifice he offered upon the altar of his cause wasn't made on the battlefield, nor in the public execution square. That sacrifice was his own flesh and blood brother, Radu, whom the Turks nicknamed the Handsome. They grew up together in Ottoman captivity, each other's sole pillar of support. Side by side, they learned to fence, to ride horses, to master the sciences, and to study the Quran. They were two halves of a shared destiny. But where Vlad saw humiliation and nurtured a simmering hatred, Radu perceived opportunity. He embraced the rules of the game, grew close to the future Sultan Mehmed, becoming his friend and, it was rumored, his lover. Radu chose the path of compromise and assimilation. When Dracula ignited his rebellion and launched his holy war, Sultan Mehmed made a move both brilliant and diabolical. He didn't merely dispatch an army, he sent Vlad's own brother against him. At the head of the Turkish forces, with the promise of being installed as the new ruler of Wallachia, Radu the Handsome entered the country. For Vlad, this was a blow far worse than any military defeat. The enemy had taken on the face of his closest kin. Political struggle devolved into a fratricidal war. He was forced to fight not merely against the Turks, but against his own past, against the only person in the world who had known him since childhood. In Vlad's eyes, Radu's actions constituted the ultimate betrayal, not just of their homeland, but of their shared blood, their common memory of captivity. Radu, in Vlad's perception, became the embodiment of everything he despised: weakness, appeasement, and a readiness to sell one's faith and homeland for comfort and power. The saga of their antagonism is nothing less than an ancient tragedy. In his fight for Wallachia's absolute, uncompromising independence, Vlad was compelled to sacrifice the last thread connecting him to human warmth. The price of his genius wasn't merely rivers of blood. It was the icy, existential solitude of a man who, for the sake of a grand objective, severed all ties, including those to his own family. 15th century Wallachia was more than just a state. It was a tectonic plate at the collision point of civilizations, a zone of perpetual friction and upheaval. Picture Targovishte, Vlad's capital city. On any given day, its streets would resonate with three distinctly different calls to prayer. The quiet, melodic tolling of bells from a small Orthodox church, where services were conducted in Church Slavonic. The severe, booming peal of bells from a Catholic cathedral in the Saxon merchants' quarter, where Mass was celebrated in Latin. And drifting from afar, from the opposite bank of the Danube, the drawn-out voice of a muezzin summoning the faithful to Salah in Arabic. This was no melting pot. Initially, it was a harsh, irreconcilable clash of worldviews, frozen in stone and sound. The clash manifested in every aspect of life. Architecture stands as the most honest witness to the era. Consider the castles Vlad built, Poenari, for instance. These were not the graceful Gothic palaces of Hungary, nor the lavish, tile-adorned residences of Ottoman pashas. Instead, they were brutal, ascetic fortresses where function, defense, completely eclipsed aesthetics. Stone, wall, battlement. Nothing superfluous. This was the architecture of survival. Nearby, in the Transylvanian cities of Brasov and Sibiu, German colonists constructed their renowned Kirchenburgen, fortified churches. A house of worship and a stronghold, all in one structure. It was the perfect symbol of the age, a place to pray to God, yet ready at any moment to withstand a siege. Faith and war had fused into a single entity. Yet, it is precisely in such high-pressure zones that the most astonishing and peculiar hybrids are born. Vlad Dracula, a fierce defender of Orthodox Christianity, proved himself a brilliant student of his enemies in the art of war. His famed light cavalry, which struck terror into the hearts of the Ottomans, was essentially Wallachia's answer to the Turkish Akıncı, similar irregular, fast-moving units designed for sabotage and lightning raids. He adopted the enemy's tactics, mutated them, and unleashed them back upon the foe. His model of governance was another such hybrid. Formally, it was an Orthodox principality in the Byzantine tradition, but in practice, it was a despotic, centralized system of power directly copied from the Ottoman Empire. The result was a political Frankenstein, an Orthodox sultan ruling on the very edge of Europe. This cultural exchange seeped into daily life, albeit slowly. Wallachian boyars, despite their disdain for the Turks, nevertheless began to adopt elements of Ottoman luxury: Persian carpets, Damascus steel, and even specific clothing items like kaftans. From the West, new mining and craft technologies, along with novel financial instruments, arrived with Saxon merchants. Dracula himself, in order to wage war, was compelled to speak the language of all these cultures. He corresponded with the Hungarian king in Latin, issued commands to his warriors in Wallachian, and to stage a diversion in an enemy camp. He could reportedly disguise himself as a Turkish merchant and converse in the impeccable Turkish he had learned in his youth. He was, in essence, a living embodiment of this cultural fault line. And how did life change for the common person who suddenly found themselves at this nexus? Imagine yourself in the shoes of a Saxon merchant from Brasov. On one hand, Dracula had brought order to the roads, meaning your caravans were less frequently plundered by bandits. That was a plus. On the other hand, he imposed extraordinarily harsh trade tariffs on foreigners to protect local merchants. That was a drawback. You could lodge a complaint with the Hungarian king, but then you'd be accused of treason and impaled. The old feudal freedoms, the habit of living by your community's laws, all of it vanished into the past. A new, terrifying, and unpredictable force emerged, the centralized state, which could both protect and destroy. For the simple Wallachian peasant, the changes were no less dramatic. Yes, a local boyar could no longer rob or murder him with impunity. But now, at the prince's first command, he had to burn his own home and crops, gather his family and livestock, and retreat into the mountains so that the enemy would find nothing but scorched earth. The old habit of a settled, predictable life was gone. It was replaced by a new one, the habit of total mobilization. Every man became a soldier, every village a partisan base. Life on the border of civilizations blurred the line between peace and war, transforming the entire populace into an army and the whole country into a battlefield. Vlad Dracula was not just a warrior, he was a brilliant media technologist of his era. Lacking a printing press, he transformed reality itself into media. Every single one of his actions was not only a military or political act, but also a meticulously choreographed informational message calculated for maximum dissemination through word of mouth. He didn't write pamphlets. He created events that became legends in their own right. The golden chalice in Targovishte that no one dared steal wasn't just a fact. It was a viral story of absolute order passed from person to person. The turbans nailed to the heads of ambassadors weren't just an execution. They were an ultimatum to the Sultan, discussed in every bazaar from Buda to Istanbul. Vlad deliberately constructed his image, the image of an absolute, inevitable, and just, in his eyes, force, almost a natural disaster, with whom no negotiation was possible, only submission or annihilation. But his media assault met with a counterattack, and this response was technologically revolutionary. Dracula's enemies, primarily Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus and the Saxon merchants, leveraged the latest innovation, Gutenberg's printing press. They unleashed the first smear campaign in history using mass media. Across the Holy Roman Empire, cheap brochures, known as flying leaves or Fliegende Blätter, began to circulate, featuring engravings and texts describing the horrifying and unheard-of deeds of the tyrant Dracula. This was truly black propaganda, where real facts of his cruelty were interwoven with monstrous fabrications. It was in these German pamphlets that the most grotesque myths first surfaced. They recounted tales of Dracula feasting in a forest of impaled victims, dipping his bread in their blood. Stories claimed he boiled Roma people alive in cauldrons, forcing their kin to consume the flesh, that he roasted infants over coals and served them to their mothers. These narratives were designed not to inform, but to dehumanize, to transform a political adversary into an infernal monster, a subhuman fiend. And the most enduring of these myths, of feasts among corpses and bread dipped in blood, proved to be the seed from which, 400 years later, the legend of the vampire would blossom. Let's examine a specific example to see how history is written by the victors of information warfare. Take a pivotal event, the Forest of the Impaled. In the official version, crafted by Corvinus's pamphlets and cemented through the centuries, this was an act of senseless sadism, a madman's banquet, reveling in the suffering of 20,000 people. This version perfectly aligned with the Dracula as monster concept and justified his arrest. It was simple, shocking, and easy to remember. But what do we find when we turn to the sources of the losing side? More accurately, to sources not biased by Hungarian propaganda. The Byzantine historian Laonikos Chalkokondyles, a contemporary of the events, describes this scene entirely differently. He doesn't relish the cruelty. He dryly states the fact. Upon seeing this field, bristling with the bodies of captured Turks, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror himself was profoundly shaken and, recognizing the impossibility of subjugating such a man, ordered a retreat. In this version, Dracula's act is not madness, but a chillingly effective yet utterly rational act of psychological warfare that secured him victory. Military logic fully corroborates Chalkokondyles' account. The victims in the forest were not civilians, but captured soldiers of the enemy army and collaborators. Thus, from the perspective of the laws of warfare at the time, it was a mass execution of enemy combatants, albeit in a horrifying form. For Vlad's army, outnumbered by the Ottomans by 10 to 1, this was the only way to halt the invasion without a decisive battle. But the version of the cold-blooded strategist was too complex. The version of the bloodthirsty maniac was simple and impactful. And it was the latter, thanks to the power of the printing press, that endured for centuries, proving that in history, victory goes not to the one who wins the battle, but to the one who tells the most compelling story about it. 12 years. 12 years Vlad Dracula spent in Hungarian captivity. First in a harsh dungeon, then under a softer house arrest. During this time, the world changed. His country, Wallachia, once again plunged into the familiar chaos of boyar feuds, torn between Ottoman and Hungarian influence. Europe, which had once applauded him, had all but forgotten its hero. And Vlad himself, stripped of power, army and homeland, transformed from a fearsome warlord into a political phantom. Yet within him, the same unquenchable fire continued to burn, a thirst for power and a desire to reclaim what was his. And one day, fate offered him a chance that became his second and perhaps most crucial point of no return. A fateful decision was put before him by his own jailer, Matthias Corvinus. The Ottoman threat had once again swelled, and the Hungarian king desperately needed an experienced, ruthless commander to patrol the Danube frontier. He offered Vlad a deal that was impossible to refuse: his freedom, an army to reclaim his throne, and the hand of his own cousin in marriage. But this grand bargain came with a steep price. More than just a vassal's oath of allegiance to the Hungarian crown, Corvinus demanded Vlad convert to Catholicism. For the bulwark of Christendom, for the very defender of the Orthodox faith Vlad had long presented himself to be, this was simply unthinkable. It wasn't merely a betrayal of religion, it was a betrayal of the very essence of his struggle, of his identity itself. It was at this crucial juncture that the pragmatism, which had always been his defining strength, transmuted into a poison that began to corrupt his core ideology. The means had definitively become the end. The early Vlad had wielded terror as a tool to achieve a noble purpose: the creation of an independent Orthodox state. Now, after 12 long years caged, the sole objective was the restoration of power itself. In his mind, it likely appeared to be a shrewd tactical maneuver. What good was his Orthodox faith, he might have reasoned, if he was rotting in a dungeon while his country lay in the hands of his enemies? First, reclaim the throne. Then, he could sort out the religious complexities. He convinced himself that the ultimate goal, restoring his nation, justified betraying its spiritual foundation. And so, he agreed. This decision created a schism, but not among his allies. By then, there was scarcely any left. The rift occurred within his own mythos, in the eyes of those who still remembered and believed in him. To the Wallachian people and the Orthodox clergy, he was more than just a prince. He embodied resistance, not only to the Muslim Ottomans, but also to the Catholic Hungarians, who for centuries had sought to subjugate their church and their lands. And now their hero, their protector, was returning, but returning corrupted, having embraced the faith of his very enemies. The idealist of yesterday, once prepared to die for faith and homeland, had transformed into a cynical politician, willing to trade his beliefs for a crown. The conflict played out between the image of Dracula the Messiah and the reality of Vlad the Opportunist. And so, the symbolic act that heralded this turning point arrived. In 1476, Vlad Dracula, freed from captivity and leading a host of Hungarian and Serbian mercenaries provided by Corvinus, once again marched into Wallachia. Picture this scene. He wasn't returning as a national hero at the head of a rebel army. He was returning as the pawn of a foreign power, as but one cog in the Hungarian war machine. His dragon banner likely flew alongside Hungarian standards. He had come to liberate his country from an Ottoman puppet, yet he himself was now a Hungarian puppet. It was a complete mirror image reflection of the situation with his brother Radu. Once, Vlad had scorned his brother for becoming an Ottoman puppet. Now, in his own desperate bid to reclaim power, he had become a Hungarian puppet. The circle had closed. He could tell himself all he wanted, that this was a temporary alliance, that once firmly established, he would regain his independence. But in the eyes of his people, he was no longer an absolute, uncompromising defender. He had merely become another player in someone else's grand scheme. The original vision, the forging of an absolutely sovereign Wallachia, free from any external influence, was irrevocably corrupted. To reclaim the body of his state, he had sold its very soul. He won his freedom, but lost his fundamental ideal. And this second, fleeting attempt to rule was no longer a heroic saga, but a tragic epilogue. He reclaimed his throne, yet he could never truly reclaim the trust and the sacred status he once held. The man who trusted no one had, in the end, betrayed himself most profoundly. What kind of society was left in the wake of the storm named Dracula? It was a land that had endured multiple waves of total upheaval. First, Vlad had ruthlessly purged the old hereditary aristocracy, replacing them with a new elite, low-born but fiercely loyal warriors. Then, after his capture, the pendulum swung violently in the opposite direction. Remnants of the old Boyar families and opportunistic newcomers, backed by either the Hungarians or the Turks, seized power and unleashed their own counter-terror, systematically eradicating Dracula's former protégés. In the end, no single faction truly won. Rather, the most unprincipled and adaptable type of politician emerged victorious, the chameleon boyar, adept at pledging allegiance to Buda, Istanbul, or whichever power happened to be dominant at the moment. Everyone who held on to any ideal suffered a crushing defeat. Both the old aristocrats with their codes of honor and the new loyalists with their faith in a strong state. Society was left decapitated, devoid of a stable elite, with an atrophied sense of loyalty to anything beyond immediate self-interest. The tragedy of Vlad's new men is a separate, bitter story. These humble warriors and small landowners, whom he had elevated from rags to riches, were the living embodiment of his grand project. Their fates were inextricably linked to his own. When he held power, they were everything. When he was imprisoned, they became nobodies. They were hunted down as accomplices of a tyrant, their granted lands confiscated, their families executed. They were aliens to the old nobility, who despised these upstarts, and to the common people, who saw them only as conduits for the prince's cruel will. This social elevator, initiated by Dracula, proved to be an express ride to the gallows. Their annihilation served as a chilling lesson for subsequent generations. Never stake everything on one man, never believe in swift change, because the inevitable backlash will be just as swift and bloody. And what became of the economy, built literally on bones? Vlad's strategy aimed at creating autarky, economic independence. He tried to foster local crafts, supported Wallachian merchants, and imposed protectionist tariffs against foreigners. But all of this was undone by his own military tactics. The scorched earth policy obliterated the very foundation of the agrarian economy. Constant warfare demanded colossal resources, siphoned from an already impoverished population. After his downfall, Wallachia, ravaged and depopulated, could no longer aspire to economic self-reliance. It definitively devolved into a raw material appendage and a tributary of the Ottoman Empire. The dream of a strong, independent economy gave way to a harsh reality. Now, people had to toil not for themselves, but to gather the Sultan's tribute on time. Concurrently, there was a dramatic shift in centers of power. Under Dracula, his capital, Targovishte, albeit briefly, had become an independent political hub, a force to be reckoned with in both Buda and Istanbul. From here, terms were dictated and ambassadors arrived. After his collapse, all decisions concerning Wallachia's fate once again originated outside its borders. The trade routes that Vlad had attempted to redirect for his benefit reverted to their old channels, controlled by Transylvanian Saxons and Ottoman merchants. The country, from being a subject of history, once again became an object, a territory for others to contend over. But the most profound upheaval was neither political nor economic. It was psychological. Imagine the worldview of someone who lived through all of this. Their consciousness had endured a horrific political whiplash. First, the arbitrary rule and lawlessness of the Boyars. Then, Dracula's chilling, paralyzing, yet predictable terror. After that, the horrors of total war, necessitating the burning of one's own home. And then, once again, chaos. Another rotation of puppet rulers, another war of all against all. Such an era incinerates from the collective soul any belief in justice, in law, in the state itself. It leaves behind only collective trauma and the deepest cynicism. The psychology of those who survived became one of fatalism. Grand ideals, independence, faith, honor, had brought nothing but blood and suffering. Heroic struggles ended in defeat. The only effective strategy proved to be not resistance, but adaptation, enduring and lying low. Don't stick your neck out, don't trust authority, and rely solely on your family and your small plot of land. This experience taught people that any order is fragile, any power temporary, and the only way to survive is to bow your head and weather the storm. Vlad Dracula's great and bloody experiment to forge a nation of heroes instead begat a nation of survivors, whose worldview for centuries to come would be shaped not by heroic impulse, but by the bitter wisdom of resignation. Although Vlad Dracula was no philosopher and penned no treatises, a single, powerful, if perhaps unconscious philosophical concept underpinned all his actions. It was the idea of the divine right of the monarch, pushed to its most logical and most brutal extreme. This concept, inherited from Byzantium, posited that the prince was God's anointed, his regent on earth. His power stemmed not from men, but from God, and therefore he was accountable to no one save the Almighty. His will was a reflection of divine will, and his judgment a preview of the Last Judgment. Vlad embraced this idea not as a beautiful metaphor, but as a direct blueprint for action. If he was God's viceroy, then his mission was to establish divine order on his sinful land. And order, in the Christian worldview, primarily meant hierarchy and the merciless punishment of evil. In this sense, Dracula was less a politician than a theocrat. His terror wasn't merely a tool of governance, it carried a sacred, almost religious significance. The execution of a thief, a traitor, or a lazy peasant was not just an act of justice. It was a ritualistic cleansing of the land from sin. The stake upon which he impaled his enemies was in his worldview not simply an instrument of torture. It was a sort of anti-cross, a symbol of the hellish torment awaiting the sinner in the afterlife. By establishing his forest of stakes, he was, in essence, creating a tangible, earthly installation of hell, reminding everyone of the inevitability of divine retribution, of which he considered himself the representative. He was not merely a ruler, he was the sword of God, given the right to punish and to pardon. But who was the intellectual engine of this era? While Vlad himself lacked a philosophical grey eminence, his worldview was shaped through dialogue and conflict with the ideas of his contemporaries. Here, a key figure, albeit an absent one, could be considered his main European opponent, Pope Pius II. This distinguished humanist, poet and diplomat was the chief ideologue of a new crusade. It was he who called upon European monarchs to unite against the Ottoman threat. He and Dracula were allies. They shared a common objective, yet they approached it from entirely different philosophical stances. Pius II was a man of the Renaissance. He thought in terms of grand European politics, diplomatic alliances, and the common Christian good. He believed in the power of persuasion, in the unity of the Christian world founded on shared culture and faith. Dracula, on the other hand, was a man of the Middle Ages, and specifically its most archaic, Old Testament version. He had no faith in alliances or treaties. He believed only in force and fear. For him, the unity of the Christian world was an abstraction, while the betrayal of a specific Christian king was a stark reality. While the Pope in Rome penned bulls and urged unity, Dracula on the Danube waged his solitary war, deeming everyone else either cowards or traitors. Their dialogue was a confrontation between humanism and fundamentalism. The Pope sought to save Christendom with the power of reason and diplomacy. Dracula sought to save it with fire and the sword. And here it is, the central clash of ideas that shaped the realpolitik of that time. On one side, the Renaissance, humanistic concept of a unified Christian republic, the Respublica Christiana. Its proponents, the Pope, Italian intellectuals, and Matthias Corvinus himself, at least in rhetoric, believed that in the face of a common threat, internal squabbles should cease. They felt it was possible and necessary to negotiate, form coalitions, and act in concert. This was a doctrine of collective security. On the other hand, there was Dracula's doctrine, which could be aptly named the besieged fortress doctrine. It declared, "Trust no one, rely only on yourself, for enemies lurk everywhere." In his world, allies were a myth. There were only fleeting fellow travelers. He perceived the notion of a unified Christian world as nothing more than a convenient fiction. The French clashed with the English, the German emperor battled the Hungarian king, and Italian city-states endlessly plotted against one another. In this relentless milieu, the only viable strategy was to transform his country into an impregnable citadel, encircling it with a blood-filled moat and bristling it with stakes in every direction. This was a clash of two survival paradigms, the hopeful pursuit of alliances versus a grim commitment to absolute solitude. And Dracula's profound tragedy lies in the fact that his somber philosophy proved far more aligned with reality than the bright ideals of the humanists. In late 1476, Vlad Dracula ascended the throne of Wallachia for the third and final time. It seemed the system, albeit at the cost of a terrible compromise, had been reset. The machinery of state terror began to grind once more. But after merely 2 months, it was all over. Vlad fell in battle against the Turks, and the very instant his heart ceased to beat, the formidable system he had forged did not merely crack. It instantaneously evaporated. It imploded from within, like a dam held back solely by the will of one man. The moment that will vanished, all the accumulated hatred, suppressed ambitions, and ancient grievances surged forth, sweeping away everything in their path. There was no external foe to dismantle it. Dracula's system was so profoundly personalized, so intricately tied to his singular personality, his terror, his genius, that it simply could not outlive its creator. Immediately following his demise, a process of entropy and self-consumption began. The new elite, his staunch retainers, were suddenly stripped of their sole protector and source of legitimacy. They wielded power only as long as Dracula stood behind them. Without him, they became ruthless upstarts, encircled by ravenous wolves, representatives of the old Boyar families who had bided their time in exile for years. A bloody massacre commenced, a veritable hunt for Dracula's people. They were tracked down, slaughtered, and their lands seized. The system, founded on fear, collapsed upon the very heads of its architects. This was no mere political crisis. It was a complete collapse of the social fabric, a reversion to the primeval chaos from which Vlad had so desperately striven to wrench his country. And upon these ashes, a grotesque struggle for legacy unfolded. But the claimants, Boyars, Ottoman and Hungarian proxies, did not vie to continue Dracula's work. They tore apart not his lands, but his very idea, each interpreting it to their own advantage. They recognized the chilling efficacy of terror and readily adopted it as a weapon. Yet, while Vlad had wielded cruelty as a surgical scalpel for statecraft, for them it became a crude cudgel for settling personal scores and seizing power. They began impaling one another with the same chilling ease with which Vlad had impaled the Turks. Thus began an era that could only be described as the age of horror's pale imitators. Every petty warlord, every pretender to the throne sought to emulate Dracula, yet they mimicked only his most monstrous outward manifestations. They replicated his ruthlessness, but utterly lacked his grand purpose. Terror ceased to be an instrument of state policy and devolved into mere banditry, a backdrop for endless feudal squabbles. The grand and terrifying vision of a strong, independent state was debased to a bloody scramble for the right to collect tribute. This was the most profound betrayal. His methods outlived his dream and became an end in themselves in the hands of utter nobodies. And so, here it is, the tale of the final splinter, the tragic end of an era. In the winter of 1476, Vlad fought his final battle. His army was meager, comprised primarily of Hungarian mercenaries and a sparse scattering of Wallachian loyalists. He stood alone against everyone, against the immense Ottoman army and most likely against betrayal within his own ranks. He was the last standard-bearer of his true idea, the final soul who believed Wallachia could and should be free. Around him were no longer comrades, but merely temporary companions, poised to see which way fortune would turn. He died as he had lived, amidst the chaos of battle. The most widely accepted account suggests that in the heat of combat, as he furiously hacked at the Turks, his own Wallachian warriors, either by tragic mistake, mistaking him for an enemy due to Turkish clothing he might have worn as a disguise, or by malicious intent, struck him a fatal blow from behind. The formidable voivode, a master of psychological warfare, fell not by a sultan's sword, but by the hands of his own people. It was the final bitter emblem of his entire life, utter solitude and betrayal as the alpha and omega of his destiny. Yet, even death brought no end to his humiliation. His body was decapitated, and his severed head, preserved in honey, was dispatched to Constantinople as the ultimate trophy. There, impaled on a stake, it was displayed for all to see upon the walls of the Sultan's palace. This was more than a mere act of intimidation. It was the symbolic end of his entire era. His enemies did not simply kill him, they seized his principal symbol, his head, his mind, his will, and transformed it into an exhibit of their victory. The last shard of the grand dream of an independent Wallachia rotted on the wall of the enemy capital, signifying a definitive and irreversible defeat. The age of Dracula ended. The age of his dark legend began. After Vlad's demise, his true historical figure did not entirely vanish, but its legacy fractured into several currents and receded into shadow for centuries. In Wallachia and Romania itself, he persisted in folk memory and folklore, yet not as a vampire, nor even as a towering national hero. He transformed into an archetypal stern, yet just, ruler, almost a mythical character who punished wicked boyars and protected the common folk. Stories about him were told by the hearth, but they were devoid of political fervor. They were more like parables of order and retribution. Simultaneously, in the West, particularly in Germany, printed pamphlets detailing his atrocities continued their existence, morphing from political propaganda into popular pulp fiction, a medieval horror show. And in Russia, the tale of Dracula the Voivode emerged, portraying him as a wise, albeit cruel, autocrat, spiritually akin to the Moscow Tsars. His image fragmented, but in none of these versions was there even a whisper of the supernatural. For nearly 400 years, from the late 15th century to the latter half of the 19th century, Vlad the Impaler remained a figure of interest only to a narrow circle of historians. His name was firmly buried in archives. Crucially, throughout all these centuries, not a single Romanian, Hungarian, or Turkish source ever linked him to vampires. Romanian folklore had its own ghouls and strigoi, but these were entirely distinct characters, unconnected to the historical prince. The real man was forgotten, and the vampire myth had not yet been born. His legacy lay in a state of suspended animation. Then, in the 19th century, during the era of national romanticism, the first rediscovery occurred. The nascent Romanian nation, striving for independence from the Ottoman Empire, desperately needed a pantheon of national heroes. Poets and historians began to excavate the past in search of symbols of resistance. And they found him. They found Vlad III. In their interpretation, he was resurrected, but in an entirely new guise. His epithet, Cepeș, the Impaler, bestowed by his enemies, was relegated to the background. The name Dracula, evoking the Order of the Dragon and the fight for Christianity, came to the fore. His cruelty was now interpreted as a tragic necessity, the sacred wrath of a patriot. From a medieval tyrant, he was transformed into a Romanian Garibaldi, a harbinger of national independence. This was his first resurrection as an icon of the national liberation movement. But almost simultaneously, thousands of miles from Romania, in the dusty quiet of the British Museum Library, a second, far more fateful rediscovery took place. An Irish theatre manager and writer named Bram Stoker, working on a Gothic novel about a vampire, whom he initially planned to call Count Wampir, stumbled upon a book about Wallachia. In it, he read a few lines about a 15th century voivode nicknamed Dracula, famous for his cruelty in the struggle against the Turks. Stoker had absolutely no interest in Romanian history. It was the name itself that captivated him. According to one account, he found a footnote stating that in the Wallachian language, Dracula could mean devil. This was pure gold. It was at this precise juncture that the greatest misreading in the history of world literature occurred. Stoker seized the resonant and ominous name of a real historical figure and mechanically grafted it onto his fictional character. He conducted no deep dive into Vlad's biography. He simply pilfered his name, much as a thief might swipe an exquisite frame for their own painting. He didn't even bother to correctly situate the setting. Vlad was the Prince of Wallachia, a southern region of Romania, while Stoker placed his count in Transylvania, to the north, simply because that name sounded more wild and enigmatic to the British ear. Thus, in the late 19th century, two parallel and entirely unrelated resurrections took place. In Romania, the historical Vlad the Impaler was pulled from obscurity to be forged into a national hero. Meanwhile, in England, Bram Stoker extracted only his name from that same historical tomb to craft a globally renowned monster. And an historical paradox unfolded. The fictionalized version, a product of literary error and brilliant marketing, proved so potent and enduring that it utterly consumed and supplanted not only the real man, but also his heroicized image. The world came to know and love not Dracula the warrior, but Dracula the vampire. This second false birth proved to be the definitive one. And now, having traversed this long and bloody path, we come full circle. We began with a simple, seemingly solvable paradox. How did a crusading hero become history's ultimate vampire? We dissected this mechanism piece by piece, revealing the political agenda, the power of the printing press, and the genius of Bram Stoker. We conducted a genuine historical investigation and, it seems, identified the culprits, putting everything in its proper place. But here lies the final, bitter irony. Despite all our knowledge, despite the fact that we now understand how it happened, the myth has not vanished. It remains just as potent. Utter the name Dracula anywhere on the planet, and 999 people out of 1,000 will envision not a Wallachian voivode, but an aristocratic figure in a cape with fangs. We have returned to our starting point, but our knowledge has not altered reality. It has only made it more tragic. The informational weapon, forged in the 15th century to resolve a fleeting political challenge, proved to be a weapon of eternal impact. It continues to operate even when we see its mechanism, when we know who pulled the trigger and why. The Black Legend proved stronger than historical truth. Fiction triumphed over reality, and this victory appears final and irreversible. And here before us stands the central, irresolvable paradox of this entire saga. Vlad Dracula was a man obsessed with the idea of absolute control over the material world. He sought to control his land, his subjects, his enemies. He built fortresses, altered social structures, and scorched reality to rebuild it according to his own design. And in this titanic struggle for dominion over existence, he suffered his most crushing and complete defeat in the very realm he likely disdained, the immaterial realm, the world of ideas, images, and myths. He, a towering figure of statecraft who tirelessly fought for the perpetual survival of his sovereign state, ultimately achieved a form of personal immortality, but ironically, as the complete antithesis of his every dream. He became an eternal exile, a being without a homeland, without subjects, without purpose, save for one, to sate an unending hunger. The man who strove to construct the most perfect order transformed into the quintessential symbol of chaos and nocturnal anarchy. He wanted to etch his name into history forever as a liberator, but instead entered it as a monster. His quest for absolute control over reality led to the complete unraveling of his own identity. This story is not merely a tale from a distant past. It is a mirror reflecting an eternal struggle. The battle between fact and narrative, between what truly happened and how it was told. The saga of Vlad the Impaler proves that the human mind is vulnerable not to the might of weaponry, but to the captivating power of a well-told story. The myth of the vampire triumphed not because it was true, but because it was simpler, more vivid, and far more terrifying than the dry and intricate truth of 15th century geopolitics. It appealed not to reason, but to primal fear. And it won. And as we witness how a fictional, blood-drinking aristocrat has utterly eclipsed a real warrior patriot, a final and perhaps paramount question arises. What ultimately proves stronger and more enduring in human history? Is it the truth, which can be proven but must be painstakingly unearthed from archives and chronicles? Or is it a grand and terrifying myth which requires no proof because it is simply felt? And do we, the people of the 21st century, with all our access to information, with all our capacity for critical thinking, have any real chance of winning this eternal war for reality? Or are the brightest and darkest specters of the past forever doomed to rule our present, no matter how desperately we try to banish them with the light of knowledge?